Hey everyone, I wasn't intending to make a video about this, but I've been feeling like I should. By now I'm sure you've heard that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Maybe you're even living through the invasion right now. If so, I hope this video finds you safe and well. Later in the video I'm going to be talking about how those of us who aren't in an active war zone can help those of us who are. But to start, I wanted to talk a bit about the conflict and also look at how all of us talk about it and what it says about us. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. But before we do, a quick content warning. This is heavy shit. I'm going to be touching on racism, fascism, queerphobia, and, of course, war and violence. But I won't be going into visceral detail. I just thought I'd mention it. So, like many people in the US, this crisis was not on my radar, I'm sad to admit. As usual, ignorance is both bliss and a privilege. I've tried my best to get caught up on the situation, which is incredibly complex and changing daily. I don't want to get lost in the weeds here since I barely pulled myself out of the research rabbit hole before finishing this script, but I'll link some resources below if you want to read up on them. Just know that no one has the full picture, and the exact reasons for the Russian invasion aren't entirely clear. But here's a brief overview of the events leading up to it. You could say Russia and Ukraine have a history. Ukraine has pretty much always hated Russia because Russia has fucked them over for centuries. The US today has a somewhat friendly relationship with Ukraine and has been sending them lethal aid and offering support. But not because of freedom or some bullshit reason like that, but because the US has business interests in the region. Recently, fossil fuels were discovered in Ukrainian territorial waters, specifically Crimea. Russia makes most of its money from the natural gas they export to Europe. Ukraine has wanted to lessen their reliance on Russian fuel. They've also been trying to take their cut of Russian profit by putting huge tariffs on one of the main gas pipelines, which travels through Ukraine to the rest of Europe. US corporations were contracted by the Ukrainian government to help build infrastructure and to extract and process these newly discovered fuels. So, what does Russia do? In 2014, they invade Crimea. Putin's justification for this, and also for supporting the separatist movements in Donbass, which is in eastern Ukraine, are those regions' ethnically Russian population and their right to self-determination. But make no mistake, Putin and the Russian government as a whole don't give two shits about anybody's self-determination, as evidenced by the constant creep of Russian imperialism in the region. Also, during the 20th century, the USSR sent Russian workers to those regions in the first place. In a lot of ways, Russian influence in much of Eastern Europe and Central Asia didn't just disappear after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's continued in some form or another since then. See Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, and their very cozy relationship with Belarus. Russia has now reclaimed Crimea, and Putin has recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as sovereign nations. But in reality, these are Russian puppet states. Supporting the separatist movements means weakening the Ukrainian government's influence in the region, as well as providing a convenient staging area for more Russian forces, giving them an even bigger edge in their plans for Ukraine. But there's another angle we need to look at. Ukraine has had a surge of far-right nationalist movements throughout the 2010s. The roots of these movements go back much further than 2013, but that's when things really came to the forefront thanks to the Maidan protests, when then-President Yanukovych pulled the country out of talks to join the EU. Under that same president, one such Nazi paramilitary group, the Azov Battalion, was incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard in 2014. Since then, Azov has been fighting separatists in Donbass and being especially brutal and war-crimey about it, as Nazis do. Lucky for Russia, because now Putin is using anti-fascism as a justification for invading Ukraine, even if it is a bullshit excuse. In 2021, Russia began moving troops and equipment to their border with Ukraine, as well as the border between Ukraine and Russian best bud Belarus. Oof, that's an alliteration. Anyway, the US and UK governments have been warning for months now that Russia planned to invade Ukraine, but Russia denied this, right up until actually invading in February of 2022. So how do we make sense of all this? If we look to the Western media, we see a narrative being pushed that Putin is just a bloodthirsty maniac who's gone completely off the rails. This is nonsense. Putin may be a strongman leader, but he's still beholden to the interests of Russian capitalists. And he's not an idiot. Putin knows exactly what he's doing. In fact, it helps his cause if Westerners think he's crazy, because if he threatens nuclear war, he knows his demands are more likely to be met, simply because the stakes are too high for any other nation or group of nations to call his bluff and intervene on Ukraine's behalf. But to imply that this invasion somehow came completely out of the blue is laughable, and it shows how much history and context you'd have to leave out to make that claim. I find it fascinating how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has managed to unite Westerners almost across the political spectrum. This is in large part thanks to the media apparatus. Now there's a clear villain on the world stage. Russia is the evil empire, just like it used to be, and everybody has an opinion about what their government or NATO should be doing, despite the fact that neither are directly involved in this conflict. Conservatives in my country are jonesing for war with Russia, and I've even seen self-described liberals on Twitter advocating for a literal preemptive nuclear strike against Russia, like it's the fucking 1960s again. Hooray, transcending political differences! This shouldn't be surprising to any leftists familiar with world history, of course. When the drums of war start beating, liberals and even leftists are just as susceptible to imperialist propaganda as conservatives. If you want to learn more about how this works, check out The Indispensable Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. Russia has its own stated reasons for invading Ukraine. Putin hates the fact that NATO membership has grown to include so many former Soviet states. Putin apparently sees it as a threat to national security, but really, it's just a threat to Russian supremacy in the region. And NATO hasn't admitted any new members in years, so this would be a weird time to start feeling threatened. Ukraine isn't currently a member of either NATO or the EU, though they did apply for NATO membership again most recently in February of 2022, for obvious reasons. Putin also cites Ukraine's and Russia's shared history as a reason for wanting to take over Ukraine from what he claims is an illegitimate government. He has made no secret that he thinks Ukraine is rightly a part of Russia. So again, it's ironic that he's backing separatist movements in Donbass because the people of Ukraine have wanted independence from Russia basically since the Russian Revolution. None of this has stopped a lot of authoritarian leftists from drinking the imperialist Kool-Aid and straight up parroting this Russian state propaganda. NATO is not to blame for Russia invading Ukraine. Russia is. NATO might often act as a proxy for U.S. interests in Europe, but the reasons for this war have much more to do with Russia, Ukraine, and their shared history. These leftists are so quick to criticize the U.S. government, but now they think the Russian government is in the right? Seriously? Others have said it before, but it needs to be said again. If you're anti-U.S. imperialism, but not anti-Russian imperialism, you're not anti-imperialism, you're just anti-U.S. But one does not have to take a side in this conflict. There are no sides. There are people trying to survive, and there are states and their agents, the soldiers, cops, and Nazi paramilitaries apparently, who do what they do to protect the state's interests. Some would say a more objective way of looking at the situation would be doing a material analysis and thinking about it in terms of two states at odds with each other. Russia versus Ukraine. Simple as that. We did a bit of that so far, and this might be closer to the truth because at least it lets Ukraine be the main character in their own story. But as anarchists, we have a different take on it. We don't support regimes. Ukrainian, Russian, or otherwise, because we realize that states and the imperialism and greed that drive them to wage war are the cause of this issue, and that those who suffer the most don't want any part in it. Instead of thinking of the war like a game of Risk or a Wikipedia article being written in real time, we need to try to focus on the human cost of the war. Right now, people are being hurt, or killed, or forced to flee their homes. Cities and towns are being destroyed. So why are so many people, even leftists, who should be supporting the struggles of everyday working class people, still thinking of this war as a fucking football game, choosing teams and blindly supporting whatever their side is currently doing? A psychologist might say, because that's the easy way out. This is a good start if we want to understand this phenomenon. Humans can be very tribalistic, and because of confirmation bias, it's easy to critically examine information and narratives that contradict our beliefs, but much harder when the facts don't vibe with those beliefs. Our brains evolved to take shortcuts, and all of us can easily fall victim to these mental pitfalls. When writing about the Syrian civil war and the Western left's response to it, British Syrian activist Layla al-Shami said this: "This left exhibits deeply authoritarian tendencies, one that places states themselves at the center of political analysis. Solidarity is therefore extended to states, seen as the main actor in a struggle for liberation, rather than oppressed or underprivileged groups in any given society, no matter that state's tyranny." This quote could just as easily be applied to any modern conflict, and Ukraine is no exception. Solidarity is at the heart of leftist ideas, but solidarity with nations and governments, any of them, only serves to legitimize imperial powers. We should stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and everyone who opposes this war, not with the capitalist state of Ukraine. As the saying goes, no war but class war. And side note, can we abandon hero worship, guys, please? I've seen so many supposed leftists holding President Zelensky up as some example of a truly great leader. Zelensky isn't a hero of the people. He's just another neoliberal politician. One who has ties to the Trump administration, no less. Or did we forget about that already? So we've seen pictures of him in combat gear next to Ukrainian soldiers. Cool. I'm not saying the pics are staged, but they're definitely good for his public image. Which, it turns out, he desperately needs after a few years of scandals linked to him and his administration. It really doesn't matter. The end result is the same. If we focus our attention on praising a politician for, I don't know, not being a Ted Cruz level douchebag, I guess, we take away attention from folks on the ground struggling to survive. It's been kind of incredible to see the outpouring of support voiced by people in the Western world. And I mean that in both senses of the word. Since it seems that most of the same people haven't been nearly as quick to render judgment on the US-backed Israeli government for violently occupying Palestine and turning it into an apartheid state, for example. Or the also US-backed Saudi government, which has been dropping bombs on the people of Yemen for years. And it's easy to call out this hypocrisy, and to point out that it's more than a little convenient that Ukraine is, if not part of Europe, then adjacent to it. That proximity certainly could be a factor in this support. But also, as a lot of people have pointed out, Ukraine is mostly filled with white people. Yemen and Palestine, not as much. But there aren't just white folks in Ukraine. There are thousands of Afro-Ukrainians, immigrants or the descendants of immigrants, for whom Ukraine is just as much a home as the ethnic Ukrainians. Reports have been coming out of Ukraine that black Ukrainians fleeing the country are being held up at the border and threatened with violence by cops, the army, and also just random people, while white Ukrainian refugees are being prioritized. A similar situation is happening with Indian students trying to leave the country. This is heartbreaking to see, but sadly not all that surprising. Similarly, queer and trans folks in Ukraine have been sharing their experiences of being in an active war zone. I've read so many stories from young LGBTQ plus Ukrainians who, when the fighting broke out, just holed themselves up in their homes, worried that if the Russian forces found them, they'd be killed on the spot. And can you blame them? Ukraine isn't the best place for queer rights, but Russia is much worse by all accounts. Anecdotally, I just saw a Reddit post where a Russian trans person was attacked for not stopping the war and personally taking down Putin's regime, I guess. I know we're supposed to be a threat to civilization and all, but fuck, guys, a little compassion goes a long way. Most people in Russia didn't want this war to begin with, especially the queer ones. Just look at all the anti-war protests popping up in Russia. People have turned out to show solidarity with the people of Ukraine and demand that the Russian government stop the invasion. It's hard to know exactly how many people have turned up, but it's at least in the thousands, since that's how many have been detained by Russian police. Also, I just want to say, I love this picture. This woman does not give a fuck. What a G. Mad respect, Svetlana. I don't actually know her name, but she looks like a Svetlana. Why can't we have that same energy instead of just boycotting anything with a whiff of Russianness and calling it a day? Or worse, doing Russia's dirty work and going around calling random Ukrainians who have nothing to do with the war Nazis. For those people directly affected by the war, they don't have the option of picking sides. They're just trying to get by. If their government helps, great. If not, and even if they do, they still need support and solidarity from the rest of us right now. So how can we actually help? Overwhelmingly, the consensus from people actually in the thick of it seems to be donating to organizations in the affected area. Folks like Operation Solidarity, which is an anarchist network in Ukraine. I've put some links in the down below part. We can also spread awareness of the issue within our own communities. Public protests would be a great way to do this, but they might not be very effective depending on where you live. Encourage solidarity among your peers. Fight imperialist and warmongering rhetoric within your own sphere of influence, both online and off. The discourse surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an example of how privileged people in the global north will use foreign conflicts to signal their own virtue and play geopolitics like a game. But it's more than that. It has to be more than that, because for millions of people, it's not some theoretical moral dilemma where the good people choose the right side and the bad choose the wrong. Actual human lives are at stake here. Instead of clout chasing, thoughts and prayers, or Ukrainian flag emojis, the people of Ukraine need our solidarity and empathy as their home is trampled by the boot heel of imperialism and war. I wish I could say I'm hopeful that things will improve, but I just don't know at this point. I don't think anyone really knows, even those directly involved. All we can do is do what we can, and remember the real people behind the shocking news stories. My heart goes out to the people of Ukraine and comrades all over the world who oppose this war. Thanks for watching Fully Automated. This is Echo, signing off.